I took my granddaughter to the park that day to bring back her smile. Instead, she told me a secret that made me make a phone call, the call that burned what was left of my family to the ground. I bought her cotton candy. We were at the top of the Ferris wheel. People were laughing down below. Then my 5-year-old granddaughter, Lily, whispered to me about the boy in the basement, and the laughter stopped. My blood felt like ice, a sudden shocking freeze in my veins that seemed to stop my heart. The bright, cheerful lights of the Cedar Creek Carnival, which had seemed so festive just a moment before, now blurred into a sick, predatory smear of color. I looked down at her small, upturned face. It was pale in the neon glow, her blue eyes wide with a fear that was ancient, a fear no 5-year-old should ever have to know. She clutched her worn teddy bear, Barnaby, so tightly her knuckles were stark white against the brown fur. He was her anchor in a storm I hadn't even known was raging. My own hands were shaking, a fine, betraying tremor. I gripped the cold safety bar in front of us, forcing them still. I had to be calm for her. I had to be the adult. The wheel began its slow, indifferent descent, bringing us back to a world that was no longer the same, a world where monsters were real and lived in my son's old house. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet when we finally got off, a lurching sensation that had nothing to do with the ride. The cheerful, tinny music pumping from the carousel speakers sounded grotesque now, a funeral dirge for our lost innocence. I guided Lily away from the crowds, away from the lights and the sounds of false joy, and found a quiet, splintered bench near the edge of the parking lot. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and exhaust fumes. I knelt in front of her, right there on the dusty asphalt, ignoring the curious stares of a family walking past. My knees ached, a sharp, grinding pain, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. "Honey, what boy?" I asked, my voice a raw, strained thing I barely recognized. Her own voice was a thread, fragile and thin. The crying boy. "Where, baby? Where did you see him?" "In the basement." She choked on the word, a small, gulping sound. "Mommy keeps the door locked. She told me never to go there. She says he's a secret." A secret. A crying boy. My mind was a broken machine, refusing to assemble the pieces. They were too sharp, too jagged. My daughter-in-law, Danielle, the woman my son, Alex, had loved with his entire being, the mother of my precious grandchild. It was impossible. It had to be a nightmare, a child's fever dream, but the raw, undiluted terror in Lily's eyes was real. It was the most real thing in this suddenly unreal world. I took her small, cold hand in mine. It was trembling. We sat there for a long moment in the semi-darkness, the sounds of the carnival a distant, mocking echo. I had to think. I had to act. I pulled out my phone, the smooth, cool glass, a strange comfort in my shaking palm. My fingers felt clumsy, thick, disobedient. I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a calm, distant drone, a voice from another planet, a planet where things still made sense. I gave her my name, Clara Granderson. 68 years old. I gave her my address. And then I tried to explain, my voice cracking, the words spilling out in a broken, nonsensical rush. I told her what a 5-year-old girl had whispered to me, suspended 100 feet in the air, a confession that had just sent our world plummeting to the ground. Returning to the suffocating quiet of my small house felt like entering a tomb. The air was thick and still with the silence of my lonely life, a silence that had just been irrevocably shattered. Lily, emotionally and physically drained by the weight of her confession, fell asleep almost instantly on the sofa, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that was the only peaceful thing in the room. I covered her with the old Afghan my mother had knitted decades ago. I sat in the dark in Alex's favorite armchair and watched the headlights of passing cars slice across the walls, each one a fleeting, ghostly presence. Waiting. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow against the anvil of my nerves. Each minute stretched into an hour. Then, a car door slammed shut outside. It wasn't the quiet, professional click of a police cruiser. It was an angry, violent sound, a punctuation mark of rage. I crept to the window and peered through the blinds. My breath caught in my chest. It was Danielle's blue sedan, and her brother, Ethan, was unfolding his large, menacing frame from the passenger side. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped animal. They knew. I didn't know how, but they knew. The doorbell didn't ring. A heavy fist pounded on the wood. 3 hard, deliberate knocks that shook the whole doorframe and seemed to vibrate deep inside my chest. I opened the door. Ethan stood there, a solid wall of angry muscle, his face a thunderous mask. Danielle was right behind him, her face a shocking mess of tears and raw fury. "What did you do?" Ethan's voice was low, a dangerous, rumbling sound that promised violence. I clutched the doorknob, its cool brass the only thing keeping me upright. My voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady. I was 68 years old. I had buried a husband and a son. I would not be intimidated by this bully. I did what I had to. Danielle pushed past him, her movements jerky and erratic. Her eyes were wild, darting around my small living room as if searching for an enemy. "You called the cops? On me? On your own family? How could you, Clara?" "There's a boy, Danielle. A crying boy in your basement." The words hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. "You're crazy!" she shrieked, the sound sharp enough to cut glass, a sound of pure, cornered panic. "You're a bitter, lonely old woman, and you're making things up to try and take my daughter away from me." Lights were coming on in the houses across the street. Curtains were being pulled back. I could feel their eyes on us. This was a performance, and it was all for them. Ethan stepped inside, his presence sucking all the air out of the room, forcing me back. He pointed a thick, nicotine-stained finger in my face. His breath smelled like stale coffee and cigarettes. "You listen to me, and you listen good," he growled. "You will call them back. You will tell them you were confused. You will tell them your grief is making you see things that aren't there. Or I swear to God, Clara, you will regret this for the rest of your miserable life." He wasn't shouting. It was worse than shouting. It was a cold, deliberate promise. I looked past his furious face at Danielle. The sweet, smiling girl my son had married was gone, completely erased. In her place was a stranger with hard, desperate eyes, and in those eyes I saw something beyond the anger. I saw a deep, primal terror. She wasn't just angry that I had found her out. She was terrified of what would happen next. After they stormed out of my house, slamming the heavy wooden door hard enough to rattle the photo of my son Alex on the mantel, an unnatural silence descended again. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was ringing, hostile, filled with the echoes of their threats. I sank onto the sofa next to the sleeping form of my granddaughter. Her small chest rose and fell evenly, a steady rhythm in a world thrown off its axis. For her, at least for a few precious hours, there was peace. For me, there was only the war that had just been declared on my front porch. My eyes were drawn to Alex's picture. His smile, usually my greatest comfort, now felt like a searing judgment. "What happened, Mom? How did you let it get like this?" I had failed him. I had failed to protect the family he had left behind. I closed my eyes, letting my mind drift back. A painful pilgrimage to the beginning, to the days when this house wasn't a silent prison, but was filled with life, with noise, with love. Sunday dinners were the anchor of our week, a sacred tradition. I'd spend all afternoon in the kitchen, the same kitchen I'd learned to bake in at my own mother's side. The rich, comforting smell of roast chicken and rosemary would fill every room. Alex would sit at the head of the old oak table, tall and strong and so full of life, it seemed impossible that life could ever be extinguished. He was a civil engineer, a man who could build bridges and highways, but he was gentle enough to cry at sad movies and spend hours helping me in my garden. And Danielle, I remember the first time he brought her home as if it were yesterday. She was a ray of pure, unfiltered sunshine, all bright, infectious smiles and easy, bubbling laughter. She followed me into the kitchen, insisting on helping, her movements quick and eager, her hands leaving little white smudges of flour on the countertops. She told me she wanted to learn all my recipes, to write them down in a special book. "I want to be a good wife, Clara," she'd said, Her cheeks flushed a pretty pink from the heat of the oven. "I want to make him as happy as you made his father." And she did. For a while, she truly did. They were deliriously happy. Their wedding day was perfect in its simplicity. A quiet ceremony in the old stone courthouse, followed by a loud, joyful barbecue in this very backyard. I have a thick photo album filled with pictures from that day. Danielle in a simple, elegant white dress, her eyes shining with a love so pure it was almost painful to look at. Alex, my handsome boy, looking at her like she was the only person in the world. They were just kids, really. Barely in their 20s, full of dreams and a fierce, beautiful optimism. I was so sure their life would be a good one, a long one. When Lily was born, this house became their second home. Danielle would call me 5 times a day, her voice a mixture of panic and wonder, asking for advice about colic, about teething, about how to get a baby to sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. I was her anchor. We were family, a real, solid, unbreakable thing, or so I thought. The change began after the accident, that single horrific event that acted as a fault line, splitting our lives into a before and an after. A rainy night on the interstate, a patch of black ice. That one, brutal phone call in the middle of the night. Alex was gone, and in the gaping, silent vacuum he left behind, something in Danielle didn't just break. It seemed to shatter into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. Or maybe something that was already broken deep inside her was finally allowed to surface. At first, all I saw was grief. A deep, silent, suffocating grief that I understood all too well, a grief that felt like drowning. I tried to reach her, to throw her a lifeline. I brought food she didn't eat. I offered to take Lily for the weekend so she could have a moment to breathe. I would just come over and sit with her in the crushing silence of her house. But she built a wall around herself, brick by painful, silent brick. "I'm fine, Clara," she'd say, over and over again. The words were always the same. Her voice was always flat, devoid of emotion. A closed door, and then her brother, Ethan, who had always been a loud, disruptive presence on the fringes of our family, moved to the center and became a permanent fixture in her life. He was the one who started answering her phone. He was the one who would tell me she was too busy for me to visit. It was he who convinced her to sell the small, perfect house Alex had bought for them, the house where Lily had taken her first steps, the house that held the last echoes of my son's laughter. "She needs to move on, Clara," he told me, his tone slick with a false concern that didn't fool me for a second, implying that I, and the memories I represented, was the one holding her back. So she moved to a characterless beige-walled apartment on the other side of town, a place with no history, no soul. My visits, once a daily occurrence, became scheduled appointments, an hour every other Saturday. The warmth and easy affection that had defined our relationship was gone, replaced by a strained, brittle politeness that was more exhausting than any argument. And Lily was disappearing right before my eyes. My bright, chattering, curious granddaughter became a quiet little ghost who trailed in her mother's wake. She stopped telling me stories about her friends at preschool. She just held Barnaby, her worn teddy bear, and watched the world from behind a veil of silent sadness. Her eyes, which had always been so big and expressive, now seemed too big for her small, pale face. They held a knowledge, a deep, weary sadness that terrified me. I finally worked up the courage to talk to Danielle about it during one of our sterile, clock-watching visits. We were in her living room, a room so neat and impersonal it smelled of nothing at all. "I'm worried about Lily." My voice sounded small in the quiet room. Danielle didn't look up from her phone. Her thumb moved relentlessly across the screen. "She's fine." "She's not fine, Danielle. She's quiet. She seems scared all the time." Finally, she looked at me. Her eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "She misses her father, Clara. And you hovering over her, constantly reminding her of what she's lost, isn't helping. You need to give us some space." Space. It was always about space, the word she used to build a fortress around herself and my granddaughter, a fortress I couldn't get into, a fortress that was starting to feel more and more like a prison. and I now understood, with a chilling, sickening certainty, that she wasn't trying to keep her grief in. She was trying to keep a terrible secret from getting out. That desperate, aching need to see Lily smile again was the only reason I'd insisted on the carnival. I had scraped together the money from my small pension, telling myself the cost was worth it if I could just hear her laugh, just once. The park was a frantic assault on the senses. A riot of flashing lights, the cacophony of competing music and distant screams, the sticky sweet smell of sugar hanging heavy in the air. It was a place of manufactured happiness, and its falseness felt profoundly, deeply hollow. Lily held my hand, but her small fingers were limp, a passive weight in mine. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't seeing the bright colors or the dizzying, spinning rides. They were seeing something else, something only she could see. We rode the carousel, its painted wooden horses rising and falling in a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. Their smiles were frozen, grotesque, just like the one I had plastered on my own face. Lily was silent, rigid. My heart felt like a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This wasn't working. Nothing was working. Then, through the chaos, she saw the Ferris wheel. It was the first thing that got a genuine reaction from her, a small, sharp intake of breath. A slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her hand in mine. "Can we, Grandma?" Her voice was a fragile whisper, nearly lost in the noise. It was the first time she had asked for anything all day. Hope, that stupid, stubborn, irrational thing, flickered inside me. "Of course, sweetheart." The ride up was slow, a gentle, creaking ascent into the twilight. The frantic sounds of the carnival faded away, replaced by the rhythmic groan of the machinery and the cool, clean sigh of the night air on our faces. Below us, the lights of Cedar Creek spread out like a handful of scattered jewels on black velvet. It was beautiful. For a foolish, fleeting moment, I let myself believe that this could fix things, that the sheer beauty of the world seen from above could somehow chase away the ugly shadows in her eyes. We reached the top. The wheel stopped, leaving us suspended in the quiet darkness, halfway between the distant, indifferent stars and the noisy, oblivious earth. Lily leaned her head against my arm. Her hair smelled like sunshine and the clean scent of childhood. She felt so fragile, so small. I held my breath, not wanting to break the delicate, peaceful spell. "Grandma?" Her voice was different now, not just quiet. It was small. Afraid. "Yes, baby? Is it bad to keep secrets? Really bad ones?" My blood ran cold. This wasn't a simple child's question. This was a confession waiting to be made. Sometimes, honey, sometimes secrets can make the person keeping them sick. She was quiet for a long time, so long I thought she might not speak again. I could feel her thinking, wrestling with something huge and heavy. Then she turned her face up to mine. Her eyes, so much like her father's, were filled with tears that glimmered in the carnival lights. "There's a boy," she whispered, the words coming out in a fast, desperate rush. "In the basement." "Mama keeps the door locked. He cries. All the time. I hear him through the floorboards at night, Grandma. I feel sorry for him. He sounds so sad and so scared." The world stopped spinning. The cheerful, glittering lights of the carnival below blurred into a sickening, nauseating smear of color. For a long, terrifying moment, I couldn't breathe. The air in the small Ferris wheel car felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me, suffocating me. A boy, in the basement, crying. The words echoed in the confined space, each one a hammer blow against the fragile walls of my heart, cracking the foundation of everything I thought I knew. I stared down at Lily, desperately searching her small, pale face for any sign that this was a child's overactive imagination, a story she'd invented after a scary ride or a strange, vivid dream. But there was no fantasy in her eyes. There was only the raw, undiluted terror of a child who has witnessed something she cannot comprehend, something that has systematically stolen her laughter and her light. My mind, which had felt so foggy with grief and confusion for 2 long years, suddenly kicked into a terrifyingly high gear, racing, connecting the dots with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. Danielle's obsessive secrecy. Ethan's controlling, menacing presence, the late-night visits, Lily's profound, unshakable sadness. It all began to click into place, forming a picture so monstrous and unthinkable that my soul recoiled from it. The Ferris wheel began its slow, indifferent descent, bringing us inevitably back to the ground, back to a world that would never, ever be the same. As soon as our feet hit the solid, unforgiving earth, I knew with a bone-deep certainty what I had to do. That was when I made the trembling, fateful call to the police. And now, standing in my living room after the humiliating, soul-crushing confrontation with Danielle and Ethan, I felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown me. I had done the right thing, the only thing a decent human being could possibly do. But what if it wasn't enough? What if they were too smart, too cruel, too damn convincing? The next morning, I drove myself to the Cedar Creek Police Department. The building was a grim, functional block of concrete and tinted glass, a place that smelled of stale coffee, industrial-strength disinfectant, and a faint, underlying scent of human misery. I sat on a hard, unforgiving plastic chair in the waiting area, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were a bloodless white. An eternity later, a weary-looking officer whose name tag read Miller led me down a long, linoleum-floored hallway to a small, cluttered office. Behind a mountain of paperwork on a metal desk sat Commander Davis. He had the tired, impassive face and the deadened eyes of a man who had seen the worst of humanity so many times that he was no longer capable of being surprised. I took a deep, shaky breath and began to tell him everything. I told him about the Ferris wheel, about Lily's exact words, whispered like a prayer in the sky. I told him about the slow, painful change in my daughter-in-law since my son's death, about Ethan's controlling, menacing presence. I told him about Lily's withdrawn state, her constant fear, her profound, soul-deep sadness. My voice shook, but I forced myself to remain calm, to present the facts as clearly and logically as I could. I was begging him, not just with my words, but with my eyes, my posture, my whole being. Please believe me. Please do something. This is real. Commander Davis listened without a single interruption, his face a perfect mask of professional detachment. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on a faded spot on the drab wall just over my head. When I finally finished, my throat raw, the silence in the small, airless room was heavy, suffocating. He finally looked at me, and his expression was one I had come to dread. Professional pity, the kind a doctor gives you before delivering bad news. "Mrs. Granderson," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any real emotion, "I understand your concern. I truly do. But what you've given me is the story of a 5-year-old child. A child who has recently lost her father and who may have had a nightmare or an overactive imagination after a very stimulating day at a carnival. You've described a family in turmoil, which is a tragic but not uncommon situation after a loss like yours. It's a sad situation, Mrs. Granderson, but it is not probable cause for a search warrant." His words were a physical blow. I felt the air rush out of my lungs as if I'd been punched hard in the stomach. "But Lily is not lying," I insisted, my voice rising in desperation, cracking under the unbearable strain. "I know my granddaughter. I know when she's telling the truth. She saw something. There is a child in that house. I am sure of it." Commander Davis gave a small, tired sigh, the sigh of a man who had heard 1,000 desperate, unprovable stories and was just trying to get through his day. "We will file a report," he said, the finality in his tone like a heavy door slamming shut in my face. "We can send a patrol car to do a wellness check, ask your daughter-in-law a few questions. But without more concrete evidence, Mrs. Granderson, my hands are tied. I'm sorry I walked out of that police station feeling smaller and more helpless than I ever had in my entire 68 years. The one system I thought I could rely on for help had dismissed me, patted me on the head, and sent me on my way. I was alone in this, utterly and completely alone." The wellness check was a farce, a pathetic, carefully orchestrated piece of theater that only served to tighten the knot of despair in my stomach until I could barely breathe. I watched from my living room window, a helpless, invisible observer, as a single police cruiser pulled up to Danielle's pristine apartment building later that afternoon. A young officer got out, adjusting his belt, looking more bored than concerned, and disappeared inside. 10 minutes. That's all it took, an eternity of holding my breath. He came back out, followed by Danielle. She was holding a calm, silent Lily by the hand, a perfect, heartbreaking picture of a loving, concerned mother. She smiled at the officer, a sweet, reassuring smile that made my stomach churn with a sick, helpless anger. They talked for a few moments on the perfectly manicured lawn, Danielle gesturing calmly, the officer nodding along, probably charmed by this poor, pretty young widow. Then he got back in his car and drove away. The entire encounter, the entire investigation into a child's potential kidnapping and torture, was over in less than 15 minutes. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Commander Davis, his voice heavy with a weary, "I told you so" finality. "We completed the wellness check, Mrs. Granderson," he said. "Your daughter-in-law was very cooperative." She explained that Lily has been having terrible nightmares since her father's death and sometimes gets confused between her dreams and reality. She invited the officer inside, showed him the entire apartment, including the basement. "It's an empty storage area, ma'am. Just some old boxes and a water heater. There was no one there. Everything appears to be in order." Of course it was empty. Of course she was cooperative. They would have moved the boy the second they knew I had gone to the police. My visit had served as nothing more than a warning, a friendly, courteous heads-up for them to cover their tracks. I hadn't helped. I had made things infinitely, catastrophically worse. That evening, the public humiliation began in earnest. It was a brutally efficient and cruel campaign. It started with a phone call from Mrs. Gable from across the street, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet faux sympathy that was more insulting than any outright accusation. "Oh, Clara, dear," she said, her tone a masterclass in passive aggression. "I just heard the most awful thing from a friend of Danielle's." "Are you all right, dear? You must be so terribly distraught to be thinking such things." The poison spread through the neighborhood like a virus, passed along in hushed phone calls and over backyard fences, growing more distorted and ugly with each telling. The story, twisted and expertly embellished by Danielle and Ethan, was that I had become unhinged by grief, a lonely old woman descending into a sad, paranoid dementia. I was harassing my poor, widowed daughter-in-law, making up wild, delusional stories in a desperate, pathetic attempt to gain custody of my granddaughter. In the space of a single afternoon, I went from being Clara Granderson, a respected member of the community for over 40 years, to the crazy old woman in the dusty house. A local cautionary tale, a figure of pity and scorn. People who had known me for decades, people who had attended barbecues in my backyard and borrowed cups of sugar from my kitchen, now crossed the street to avoid me. Their friendly smiles were replaced by awkward, pitying glances, their eyes sliding away from mine as if my madness were contagious. The whispers followed me wherever I went, a persistent, corrosive murmur. At the grocery store, the young checkout girl, who had known me since she was a child, asked if I needed help carrying my single bag of groceries to the car, her eyes full of the kind of condescending concern you reserve for the frail and mentally incompetent. I felt my face flush with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. The worst part was the profound, suffocating loneliness. The phone stopped ringing. My best friend, Brenda, a woman I had talked to every single day for the past 20 years, suddenly seemed to be too busy to answer my calls. I left 3 messages. She never called back. The walls of my house, once a source of comfort and cherished memories, now felt like the walls of a prison. I was trapped, silenced by a public narrative I had no way to fight. I would sit for hours in the living room, staring at Alex's photograph on the mantelpiece, his smiling, handsome face, a constant, painful reminder of the family I had lost, of the life that had been stolen from me. "What do I do, Alex?" I would whisper to the empty, silent room. "What am I supposed to do now?" The silence was my only answer. They had done more than just discredit me. They had methodically, cruelly erased me. They had taken my voice, my credibility, my place in the community I had called home for my entire adult life. I was a ghost in my own life, a powerless specter watching as the world moved on without me. And the only other person who knew the truth was a terrified 5-year-old girl who was now trapped back in the hands of the very people she was so desperately afraid of. The despair was a physical weight, a heavy stone pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to hope. I had hit rock bottom. There was nowhere left to go but up, but I couldn't, for the life of me, see a single handhold in the crushing darkness. Just when I thought I was completely and irrevocably submerged in the darkness, a small, unexpected sliver of light appeared. It came in the form of a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer it, too weary to face another pitying voice or veiled accusation. But something made me pick it up. "Clara? This is Helen Henderson, Lily's preschool teacher." Her voice was a lifeline thrown into my sea of despair. She had been on a family vacation for the past week and had just returned, completely unaware of the vicious drama that had consumed our neighborhood. "Clara, I'm so sorry to bother you at home," she said, her voice laced with a genuine concern that made my eyes well up with tears. "But I just ran into a neighbor who told me the most bizarre, upsetting story, and I wanted to check in with you directly. I also wanted to tell you something I observed before I left for my trip. I'd noticed a significant change in Lily. It was more than just sadness, Clara. It was a deep-seated fear. I held my breath, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone, a fragile, forgotten feeling called hope beginning to stir in the pit of my stomach. "What did you notice?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid that if I spoke too loudly, this mirage of support would disappear into the ether. "Her drawings," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice firm and confident, the voice of a woman who trusts her own professional judgment. "Lily has always loved to draw. Her pictures are usually so bright and happy, full of flowers and sunshine and rainbows. But lately, they've been different, dark, unsettling. She keeps drawing the same thing over and over." A big dark box in the corner of the page with a small crying stick figure trapped inside, and there are thick black lines drawn across the box like bars on a cage. When I asked her what it was, she just shook her head and started to cry, a deep, silent kind of crying that just broke my heart. The teacher's words were a validation, a small, solid piece of evidence in a churning sea of lies and poisonous speculation. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't a delusion. Someone else saw it. Someone else believed me. She also started doing something very strange and secretive during snack time, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice gaining momentum as she spoke, the voice of a professional connecting the dots. She would hide part of her snack, a cookie or a bag of crackers, in her backpack or her cubby. When I gently asked her why she wasn't eating it, she looked around the room to make sure no one else was listening, and she whispered that it was for the hungry boy. I thought it was just an imaginary friend, Clara, a way of coping with her grief and loneliness. But now, after what I've heard, I've been a teacher for 25 years. I don't believe you're crazy. Children don't lie about things like this. Not in this way. Their pain always finds a way to speak, through their drawings, through their play, through hidden crackers. We talked for a few more minutes, and with every word she spoke, I felt a flicker of my old strength, a strength I thought had been extinguished forever, begin to return. I wasn't alone. Someone else saw the truth. Someone else believed me. After we hung up, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the autumn leaves drift to the ground, my mind racing, no longer spiraling in despair, but actively, desperately searching for a path forward. Mrs. Henderson's words had given me an idea, a terrifying long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I needed to find someone else who had seen something, anything, out of the ordinary. My thoughts turned to my neighbors. Most of them had already tried and convicted me in the court of public opinion, their minds closed and locked. But there was one person who had always kept to herself, a woman who rarely engaged in the neighborhood gossip mill. Mrs. Peters, an elderly widow who lived in a small apartment 2 houses down from Danielle's complex. Her late husband had been an avid bird watcher, and she had kept up his hobby, often sitting on her second-floor balcony with a pair of high-powered binoculars, her gaze fixed on the treetops. She saw everything that happened on that street. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone. My pride was already in tatters. I had already been publicly humiliated. What was one more rejection, one more pitying look? Swallowing the hard, bitter lump of that pride, I found her number in the old church directory and dialed, my heart pounding with a nervous, hopeful rhythm. I introduced myself, my voice trembling slightly, and asked if she had a moment to talk. To my surprise, her voice was warm and kind, without a hint of judgment or condescension. "Of course, dear," she said. "I've been meaning to call you. I saw what that young man and your daughter-in-law did on your porch the other day. It was a disgrace. I don't pay much mind to gossip, Clara. I prefer to trust what I see with my own two eyes." A wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy washed over me. I had found another ally. I drove to Mrs. Peters' apartment that afternoon, a new, fragile hope blooming in my chest like a hardy winter rose in a frozen garden. She welcomed me into her neat, sunlit home, which smelled of lemon polish, old books, and freshly brewed Earl Grey tea. We sat in her comfortable living room in two matching floral armchairs positioned by a large picture window that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the lake view of the street where Danielle lived. I told her everything, the words pouring out of me in a torrent of fear, frustration, and now a sliver of desperate hope. She listened patiently, her clear blue eyes never leaving my face, her expression one of deep, quiet concentration, her head tilting slightly as she processed each new, horrific detail. When I finally finished, my throat raw and my story hanging in the quiet air between us, she nodded slowly, a thoughtful, serious expression on her face. "I knew something wasn't right over there," she said, her voice quiet but firm as steel. "That brother of hers, Ethan. He gives me a bad feeling. He has cruel eyes like a wolf. He comes and goes at all hours of the night, always in a hurry, always looking around like a nervous, hunted animal. And he's not always alone. Sometimes there are other men with him, rough-looking types in a dark windowless van. They carry things in and out of the building, heavy-looking bags and boxes, always in a hurry, always looking over their shoulders as if they're afraid of being watched." My heart began to beat faster, a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. This was more than I could have hoped for. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was something organized, something sinister, something criminal. "But there's more," Mrs. Peters said, leaning forward in her chair and lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, even though we were alone in the apartment. "About 2 weeks ago, I was up late. My arthritis was acting up something fierce, and I couldn't sleep. I was sitting right here, in this chair, just watching the stars. It must have been 2, maybe 3 in the morning. I saw Ethan's truck pull up. He and your daughter-in-law got out. They were arguing. I couldn't hear the words, of course, but the anger was palpable, even from this distance. She was crying, trying to pull away from him, and he grabbed her arm hard. Then he opened the back door of the truck and pulled something out. It was dark, but the security light in the parking lot was on, and I saw it clearly through my husband's old bird-watching binoculars. It was a child, Clara, a small boy limp in his arms, like he was asleep or something else. He was so still. They carried him inside the building, and I haven't seen him come out since." The air in the sunlit room grew cold. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the horrifying, vivid image she had just painted. A small boy, limp in Ethan's arms. This was it. This was the proof I needed. This was the concrete, irrefutable evidence that Commander Davis had demanded. "Mrs. Peters," I said, my voice hoarse, thick with a mixture of horror and overwhelming relief, "would you be willing to tell this to the police? Every single word?" She looked me straight in the eye, her expression unwavering, her back ramrod straight with the conviction of a righteous woman. "For that little boy." I'd do it in a heartbeat. Armed with this new, powerful testimony, and with the information from Mrs. Henderson about the drawings and the hidden snacks, I went back to the police station. This time, I didn't ask to see Commander Davis. I walked up to the front desk and said, my voice clear and steady, "I need to speak with Commander Davis immediately. It's regarding a missing child." The desk sergeant, a young man who had looked at me with pity on my last visit, saw the new, steely resolve in my eyes and didn't argue. He led me straight to the commander's office. I laid it all out for him, calmly and methodically, my voice no longer trembling with desperation, but ringing with cold, hard certainty. The teacher's testimony, the drawings, Lily hiding food for the hungry boy. And finally, Mrs. Peters's detailed, damning eyewitness account of a small boy being carried into the apartment in the middle of the night. I watched his face as I spoke, saw the flicker of doubt in his tired eyes be replaced by a dawning sense of alarm, and then a grim, professional focus. He picked up his phone and made a call, his voice sharp and urgent. "Get me the file on all missing children reported in the Tri-County area for the past month," he barked into the receiver. "Focus on boys, aged 4 to 6, now." He hung up and looked at me, his expression transformed. "Wait here, Mrs. Granderson." A few minutes later, another officer came in with a thin manila file. Commander Davis opened it, and his face went pale beneath his tan. He turned the file around so I could see. On the top was a school photograph of a smiling, dark-haired little boy with big brown eyes and a happy, gap-toothed smile. His name was Leo. He was 5 years old. He'd been abducted from a playground 30 miles away 2 weeks ago. It was him. It was the boy from the basement, and he had a name. The sight of that little boy's smiling face, so full of a life and uncomplicated childish innocence that had been stolen from him, broke something deep inside me. All the grief, the fear, and the suffocating uncertainty I had been carrying for weeks, for months, for 2 long, lonely years, coalesced into a single sharp point of cold, clear, righteous rage. This wasn't just about my broken family anymore. It wasn't about the poisonous whispers of my neighbors or my own wounded pride. It was about him. It was about Leo. Commander Davis snapped into action, his previous bureaucratic weariness completely gone, replaced by the focused, urgent energy of a man on a mission. He was barking orders into his radio, dispatching officers, talking on the phone with a judge to get an immediate, no-knock search warrant signed. The atmosphere in the sleepy, quiet station had transformed from one of apathy to a tense, humming hub of controlled, purposeful chaos. In the space of 5 short minutes, I was no longer a crazy old woman with a wild, unsubstantiated story. I was their star witness, the key that had unlocked the whole horrific, unthinkable case. Davis asked me to wait in a small, private room, an interrogation room probably, while they organized the raid team. The minutes ticked by like hours. I paced the small, windowless room, the worn linoleum cool beneath my feet, my mind a sickening whirlwind of terrifying, frantic possibilities. What if they had moved him again? What if they saw the police gathering and heard him to keep him quiet? What if we were too late? I clutched the worn, creased photo of my son, Alex, that I kept in my wallet. His familiar smile a painful comfort. I prayed to him, to God, to anyone who was listening. Please, Alex, watch over them. Please let him be okay. Please let this nightmare end. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of holding my breath, Commander Davis came back into the room, his face grim and set like stone. "We're ready," he said, his voice low and serious. "We're going in now. I want you to come with us, Mrs. Granderson. You'll stay in the car, well out of the way, but we might need you there to identify your granddaughter, to keep her calm after it's over." I nodded, my throat too tight and dry to speak. We drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Creek in a silent convoy of unmarked cars, no sirens, just a deadly, purposeful procession, heading towards the unthinkable evil that was hiding in plain sight. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in breathtaking, violent shades of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent masterpiece that served as a backdrop to the human ugliness that was about to unfold. We parked a block away from Danielle's apartment building, and the officers, now clad in dark, heavy tactical gear, moved out, fanning across the manicured lawns like silent, avenging shadows. I sat in the back of the car with a young female officer whose kind eyes did little to soothe the frantic, painful pounding of my heart. I could see the front of the building, the windows dark and lifeless. It looked so normal, so peaceful, so aggressively, terrifyingly suburban. How could such a monstrous horror be hiding behind that ordinary, unassuming facade? The raid was shockingly swift and clinically silent. The officers breached the door in a matter of seconds, a barely audible thud that was more felt than heard, and then they disappeared inside. The silence that followed was the most terrifying part of all. It stretched and warped, a thick, unbearable quiet that was worse than any scream. I sat there, my body rigid, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, staring at the open, dark doorway of that apartment, straining to hear something, anything, a shout, a cry, a gunshot. But there was nothing, just the whisper of the wind in the autumn trees and the frantic, desperate beating of my own heart against my ribs. The female officer tried to make small talk, asking me about my garden, trying to distract me with a gentle, professional kindness, but I couldn't hear her words. My entire being, every nerve, every cell, was focused on that apartment, on the small, fragile life that hung in the balance inside. Then, after an eternity that lasted maybe 3 minutes, the door opened again. An officer emerged, speaking urgently into his radio. A moment later, 2 more officers came out, and between them, struggling and spitting like a cornered animal, was Ethan. His face was contorted in a mask of pure, animalistic rage, and he was shouting curses that were lost in the distance. They forced him into the back of a waiting car and slammed the door. Then Danielle was brought out. She wasn't fighting. She was limp, like a broken doll, her face ashen, her eyes vacant and staring into nothingness. She looked utterly and completely broken, but my eyes were searching for something else, someone else. And then, through the open doorway, I saw him. A paramedic in a crisp blue uniform emerged from the dark doorway, and in his arms, wrapped in a thick gray institutional blanket, was a small child. It was Leo. He was pale and frighteningly thin, his dark curly hair matted with sweat and grime. But he was alive. His large brown eyes were wide with a mixture of raw, animal terror and profound confusion as he blinked in the twilight. But he was breathing. He was alive. A wave of relief so powerful and all-consuming, it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me, and my carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. I started to sob, not quiet, dignified tears, but deep, ragged, ugly breaths that shook my entire body, a primal release of all the fear and tension I had been holding inside for days. The young officer beside me put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "He's safe now, ma'am," she said softly, her own voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You saved him. He's safe." They put Leo in the back of a waiting ambulance, and I saw his small, dirty hand reach out from the blanket, as if searching for something, anything, to hold on to in this new, terrifying world. My heart broke for him, for the unimaginable trauma he had endured in that dark, silent place, for the long, painful road to healing that lay ahead for his body and his spirit. But for now, he was out of that basement. He was out of the darkness. That was all that mattered. After the ambulance, its lights now flashing but its siren mercifully silent, pulled away from the curb, Commander Davis came over to the car. His face was etched with a grim satisfaction, the face of a man who had seen justice done. "We found him in a locked storage closet in the basement," he said, his voice low and tight with a barely contained professional anger. "There was a bucket, a thin, filthy mattress, and nothing else. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, but the paramedics are optimistic. They think he'll be okay. You saved his life, Mrs. Granderson. Another day or 2 in there. I don't even want to think about what would have happened." He told me they had also found my granddaughter, Lily, hiding deep inside her bedroom closet, clutching Barnaby so tightly her knuckles were white. A kind-faced child services worker was with her now, and she was physically unharmed, though Davis admitted she was deeply, profoundly traumatized. "Your daughter-in-law confessed everything on the spot," he continued, running a tired hand over his face. "The whole sordid, ugly story. It seems her brother, Ethan, got himself into some very serious gambling debt with some very dangerous people. He couldn't pay. So he offered them a different kind of payment. He orchestrated the whole kidnapping. Danielle claims he threatened to harm both her and Lily if she didn't cooperate, that she was too scared to go to the police. It'll be up to a jury to decide how much of that is the truth and how much is a desperate, pathetic attempt to save her own skin." He opened my car door, the cool evening air a welcome relief. "Child Services will need to place Lily in temporary emergency custody," he said, and my heart plummeted, a sudden cold dread. But then he continued, looking me directly in the eye, his gaze steady and for the first time, full of respect. "Given the circumstances and your relationship with the child, the best and most stable place for her right now is with you." The words were the sweetest, most beautiful I had ever heard. I was going to get my granddaughter back. I was going to be able to hold her, to comfort her, to tell her how unbelievably brave she was. They brought her out to me a few minutes later, a small, trembling figure wrapped in a heavy police blanket, her face pale and tear-streaked in the flashing red and blue lights. Her eyes found mine across the chaotic scene, and I opened my arms. She ran into them, a tiny, desperate missile, burying her face in my coat. Her small body shook with silent, wrenching sobs. I held her tight, rocking her back and forth, whispering over and over again that she was safe, that Grandma was here, that everything was going to be all right, saying the words as much for myself as for her. I don't know how long we stood there, clinging to each other amidst the flashing lights and the controlled chaos of the crime scene. Two survivors of a storm we never should have had to weather. But as I held my granddaughter, my cheek pressed against the top of her soft hair, I knew one thing for sure. The nightmare was finally, truly over. We could begin to heal. The weeks that followed were a chaotic, disorienting whirlwind of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and quiet, difficult adjustments to our new, fragile reality. The story of the boy in the basement became a local media sensation, and for a short, surreal time, I was hailed as a hero. Reporters camped out on my lawn, their cameras and microphones a constant intrusive presence. Neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid me just weeks before now brought over baked goods and offered their stammering, heartfelt apologies, their eyes filled with a guilt I didn't have the energy to acknowledge. I accepted their casseroles with a polite, distant nod, but something inside me had fundamentally changed. The easy, uncomplicated trust I once had in the world, in my community, was gone, replaced by a hard-won, cynical wisdom that felt heavy in my bones. The true heroes in this story I knew were the children. Lily, for her incredible, earth-shattering courage in speaking a terrifying truth when every adult around her was failing, and Leo, for his astonishing, heartbreaking resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. I met Leo's parents at the hospital, a wonderful, loving couple from a town 30 miles away who had been living through every parent's worst nightmare for 2 long, agonizing weeks. They hugged me, their tears soaking the shoulder of my blouse, and their raw, overwhelming gratitude was a healing balm to my own wounded, weary soul. They insisted I become a permanent part of their lives, a beloved fixture they lovingly and tearfully called Grandma Clara. And so, our 2 broken families began to slowly, carefully, stitch themselves together with threads of shared grief and immense gratitude, creating something new and unexpected, something stronger forged in the fires of shared trauma. Ethan was denied bail and is now facing a long, terrifying list of federal charges that will likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his miserable life. Danielle, in exchange for her full and immediate testimony against her brother and the entire criminal ring he was involved with, received a significantly reduced sentence. She writes me letters from prison, long, rambling, tear-stained letters, filled with a remorse that feels genuine and agonizing. She talks about how Ethan manipulated her, preying on her grief and financial instability after Alex's death, twisting her fear into a suffocating web of complicity. I read them. I fold them up and put them in a box. I don't know if I can ever forgive her for what she allowed to happen, for the risk she put our Lily in. Forgiveness is a long, winding, and complicated road, and I'm not sure I'm ready to walk it yet. But for Lily's sake, for the chance for her to one day have some kind of relationship with the mother she still loves, I'm willing to try. My granddaughter's healing is a slow, delicate, and often painful process. For the first few weeks she was back with me, she was almost completely silent, her trauma locked away behind a thick wall of fear. She rarely left my side, a small, constant shadow. But with the help of a wonderful child therapist named Dr. Miller, and with a constant, unwavering supply of patience, love, and freshly baked cookies, she slowly began to emerge from her protective shell. The nightmares that had her waking up screaming in the night became less frequent. The smiles, once so rare and fleeting, started to return, small and tentative at first, then brighter and more confident with each passing day. Today, 6 months after that terrible night, Leo and his parents came over for a barbecue. The sun is shining brightly in a clear blue Midwestern sky, and the backyard, which had been silent and empty for so long, is filled with the most beautiful sound in the entire world: children's laughter. I watch from my kitchen window, my hands covered in flour, as Lily and Leo, now inseparable best friends, chase each other through the cool spray of the sprinkler, their small bodies overflowing with an energy and a pure, uncomplicated joy I thought I might never see in her again. Lily is no longer clinging to Barnaby. The worn teddy bear now sits on the porch swing, a silent, retired guardian watching over them from a distance. On my mantelpiece, right next to Alex's photograph, there is a new picture frame. It holds a snapshot of me, Lily, Leo, and his parents, taken last week at the park where this whole nightmare began. We are all smiling, a messy, imperfect, but very real family. I know the scars of what happened will always be with us, faint, invisible lines that map the places where we were broken. But as I watch my granddaughter, her face tilted up to the sun, her laughter bright and clear and fearless in the warm afternoon air, I know that we are more than our scars. We are the survivors. We are what grows after. And for the first time in a very long time, I feel a profound and quiet sense of peace. The storm has passed, and in its wake, against all odds, new life and new hope are beginning to grow.